I'm Angela.
And I'm Paige.
Join us as we dive into our obsession with true crime, history, and mysterious stories. We'll explore the intricate details of the corrupt, the cruel, and the calculating.
We assume no responsibility or liability for any errors or omissions in the content of this episode. The Corrupt Podcast is based on the facts and our opinions of the case. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Corrupt Podcast.
12-year-old Jonelle Matthews disappeared from her home on December 20th, 1984. The cold case would be solved in 2019 when Jonelle's remains were discovered almost 35 years later. The same year, Steve Pankey was arrested for Jonelle's murder. Jonelle Matthews was born on February 9th, 1972, in Santa Barbara, California. Jonelle's biological mother was 13 years old and had placed Jonelle up for adoption. Jim and Gloria Matthews had been struggling to get pregnant again after their daughter Jennifer was born 3.5 years previously. They adopted 6-week-old Jonelle and left the adoption open, with the possibility for Jonelle and her biological mother to make contact again when Jonelle was 18 years old. The Matthews family moved from California to Greeley, Colorado in the summer of 1978. Greeley, Colorado was a small town in 1984 with a population of 50,000 people. Today, the population has doubled at 107,000 people. Greeley is pretty centrally located. It's an hour drive to either Denver or Boulder, Colorado. And the family relocated to Greeley after Jim had accepted a position at Dayspring Christian School as the director of development.
By 1984, Gloria, Jonelle's adoptive mom, worked at a restaurant and Jim was an elementary school principal. Jonelle was described as kind and loving. She also loved to perform music.
Jonelle's sister, Jennifer, says that she wishes things could have been different, and maybe she wasn't the best sister. But keep in mind that they were also 12 and 16-year-old girls.
Jonelle Matthews disappeared from her home just 5 days before Christmas on the evening of December 20th, 1984. Gloria planned to visit her parents in Los Angeles as a Christmas surprise. The family had apple cider together before splitting up for the evening. Jonelle was being disagreeable. She was upset that they wouldn't be doing Christmas together. So they had made plans to celebrate Christmas on December 26th after Gloria returned home from her parents. Gloria kissed both girls and headed to the airport around 5 p.m. Jennifer had a home basketball game that night, and Jonelle had an honor choir middle school concert.
Earlier that week, Jonelle had been home from school 2 days with a cold, but she insisted on going to school on the third day so that she could still perform in the choir concert. And this choir concert was a big deal because it was going to be televised, so she was really excited about it.
That's so sweet. She had a cold and she was dedicated.
She was dedicated. All of her friends were excited. This was a really big deal for the community.
At 6 p.m., Jim went through McDonald's to get Jonelle something to eat before dropping her off at school for her choir concert. She got out of the car and loaded onto the school bus with the other children. This would be the last time Jim would see his daughter. Jim then went to Jennifer's basketball game. It was agreed that one of 2 sets of friends would give Jonelle a ride home after the concert, but Jim was unsure when she would be getting home. At 7 o'clock, Jonelle participated in the televised choir concert.
In an effort to find leads, the video was released by police in 2018, so you can find this concert on YouTube.
Have you watched it?
I have watched it. You can see they're standing at almost like a diagonal, and you really pay the closest attention to the clothes that she's wearing, because that's the clothes that she's found in 35 years later. And that's how they knew, investigators would say, the clothes, the age of the remains, and then what really stuck with them was her braces. They knew that it was her based on her braces. The concert was over by 8 p.m. Jonelle caught a ride home with a friend, Deanna Ross, and Deanna's father, Russ Ross. At 8:25 p.m., Jonelle arrived home. Russ noted that the garage door was partially up, but he didn't see anything else abnormal. When interviewed later, Deanna Ross would say,
Jonelle needed a ride home, so she hopped in our truck and we took her home. My dad waited until he saw her flick on the light. That was our sign that she made it inside and everything's fine.
Which is a really smart thing for them to do, to have a signal there. Hey, flip on the light, flip it on and off so that we know that you made it in safely.
Yeah.
I've never heard of anybody else doing that before. I thought that was really, really smart. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Jonelle answered the phone and took a message for her father. This was an employee telling Jim Matthews that she would not be into work the next day. Jonelle left a written note on the family message board, and this would be the last time anyone would speak to Jonelle. Jennifer's game ended around 9 p.m., and Jim drove straight home. We know that Jennifer was not with him, but we don't know why. She was 16 years old, so she could have driven herself or caught a ride with a friend. Jennifer says that she didn't see Jim at the game, but she did hear him, so he must have been cheering for her.
I'm confused why he didn't stay with Jonelle. You know, like Jennifer was 16, Jonelle was younger, so why wouldn't he have stayed with Jonelle? Wouldn't that, like, as a parent, wouldn't you think he would want to?
I wondered the same thing, but I am an only child. I only have one child. So to me, I kind of struggle with this. How do single parents juggle it anyways? I feel like that's got to be a struggle. You're always picking one game over the other.
I guess so, because my sister does think I'm the golden child. And it's not true. She thinks this, but it's not true.
Did your parents pick your games above hers consistently?
I didn't play sports.
Me either, so.
I tried and gave up in elementary school.
Then why does she think you're the golden kid?
I don't know. Who knows nowadays?
So I'm not sure if it's something like that. Maybe it was Jim's turn to go to Jennifer's.
Maybe.
Typically, there would have been two parents. You know, Gloria could have gone to Jonelle's. Jim would have gone to Jennifer's. Not sure. We'd have to have somebody with multiple children let us know how this plays out. Jim arrived home at 9:30 p.m. He parked in the garage and went into the house. Originally, he reported that the garage door was open when he got home. And there has been some debate on the relevance of the garage door being open. It seems odd to me that the garage door would be open in December in Colorado, just due to the temperatures, but it might be something that they left open frequently. Like maybe this was a habit, like they just left home and they left that garage door open.
They could have had a cat too. I'm just saying that because we had cats and we cracked it open, the garage door, so our cats could get inside.
Oh, that's a thought.
I don't know if they had one, though.
And the reports go back and forth. Sometimes he says the garage is open. Sometimes he says it was closed. There's just not really any consistency. And you're talking 30 years later, so it's probably really hard for him to remember what he saw in light of everything that happens later.
Yeah.
After entering the house, Jim said hello to Jonelle, but didn't receive a response. He went downstairs and could see that Jonelle had been home. The TV was on, and her pantyhose or stockings were laid on the couch. Jim went upstairs, but still couldn't find Jonelle. Jennifer arrived home by 10 p.m., and in an interview, Jennifer says that as soon as she got home, she could tell that something was wrong.
Jim waited for Jonelle to come home, hoping that she was at a friend's house. At 10:10 p.m., Jim started calling around to her friends and still couldn't find Jonelle. Russ told Jim that they dropped Jonelle off at around 8:30 p.m. Russ told Jim that Jonelle had flipped the light switch on so they knew she made it inside, but also that the garage door was partially opened. Jim knew right away that something wasn't good here when he left the garage door had been shut.
So there you hear him say that it had been shut and that would have been abnormal for them to leave the garage door open, which I think makes sense. You know, in Ohio, we don't usually leave our doors open in December.
Mm-mm. Jim called his pastor for advice. The pastor told Jim that he needed to call the police, so at 11:02 p.m., Jim called the police. Greeley police had 70 to 80 officers in the department at that time. They responded right away to the call.
Which is amazing, because today she could have been considered a runaway.
Yes. The police department confirmed every pair of Jonelle's shoes were accounted for. So if she was a runaway, she left in December in Colorado without shoes, but she did take her coat with her. The only evidence found at the scene were footprints just outside of the house. The prints led from the garage to the garden-level windows on the back of the house. Someone had used Jim's garden rake to scrape over the footprints. The police waked Jennifer up so they can fingerprint her room.
The evidence showed that the same footprints walked through grease in the garage on the way to the rake and on the way to put the rake back. And this is a part of the evidence that the police keep close to them. They never release this. the fact that the footprints had been raked over.
So it's like if you're raking footprints over in the snow, what happens to the footprints that you're making at that same time?
After you put the rake back in the garage and walk away?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very strange. Unless it went straight to the curb where their car was.
And he kind of just raked it in front of him. Or whoever it was, raked it in front of him and backed up.
Right. It wasn't a well thought out plan, that's for sure. Otherwise, they wouldn't have walked through the grease in the garage and tracked that around.
Mm-hmm. Gloria called the house from Los Angeles a little after midnight to let Jim know that she had arrived at her parents safely. Jim told Gloria that Jonelle was missing. At 6:30 a.m. on December 21st, 1984, Jennifer heard about Jonelle's disappearance on the radio while getting ready for school. She was escorted to school by the police department.
This really shows that Greeley took Jonelle's disappearance seriously right away. The police didn't know if Jonelle had been targeted, so they watched Jennifer as well. The police department canvassed the neighborhood. They searched fields and river bottoms for Jonelle. A helicopter and bloodhounds were used to search the neighborhood. A neighbor reported that his dog began to bark at the fence at 8:42 p.m. the night before. The dog went crazy, and it was nothing that the dog had done before, and this could have been the time that the intruder was entering the home, or possibly when Jonelle was being kidnapped. We know that she was home at 8:30 to answer the phone. Gloria flew home from Los Angeles on the evening of December 21st. On Christmas Eve 1984, police announced that they had no leads or suspects. They bring in the FBI. All phone calls that came into the Matthews home had been answered by their pastor, so that the family wasn't involved. Here they're looking for ransom calls. They're hoping that somebody is going to call and say that they have Jonelle. And so the pastor is kind of fielding all of these calls, hoping that somebody's going to call with information on Jonelle.
So what, does the pastor just sleep over at the house? Or is he just there 8 a.m. in the morning and leaves at 9 p.m. at night? Kind of a thing.
I'm not sure. It's back in the house phone days, so hopefully no one's calling after 10 p.m. In January 1985, Greeley Police Department received a call from Pastor Steve Pankey. Steve said that someone confessed to him with the details of Jonelle's disappearance, but he was unable to provide the details. Pastor Steve Pankey also said that Russ Ross and the Sunnyview Church might have been involved. The police department thought it was a prank call at the time.
I don't know if I like how they handled this. Wanky should have been suspect number one. You know what I'm saying?
He should have, or they should have followed up with him at this point.
I understand that they were getting a lot of prank calls.
I think they're getting a lot of calls with misinformation. Maybe good-hearted people that think they saw something, but it doesn't actually add up to be a clue. And so this was just one that they wrote off and kind of moved on. And
that's what made me think about it again, because he might have presented himself as a pastor on the phone as well. Oh, hey, this is, Pastor Steve Pankey. And this is what I think happened. So that's probably a little more trustworthy. Pastor to pastor, if the pastor is picking up the phone and then another pastor calls, they have that, telepathy.
I don't know. Whatever he said at the point, though, they thought it was a prank. They were okay, there's just no relevance to this. He came off not quite all there, even in that phone call in January of 85. So unfortunately, Jim became the primary suspect for the police. He was the closest family member and potentially the last person to see Jonelle, so they really lean on him. Jim said that he respected and understood the investigation in the beginning. When they asked him to take a polygraph test, he agreed. He flies down to Mississippi and takes this lie detector test with the FBI. Jim says that he was told by the FBI that he fails the polygraph test. He thinks that the FBI was trying to trick him. In a police interview that I watched, the police say that he did fail the polygraph exam. So this makes them lean on him even harder. After the polygraph test, Jim became frustrated with the investigation. He told investigators they were looking in the wrong direction and he was innocent.
The Rescue Jonelle Committee was created on February 7th, 1985. Jonelle had been missing for 49 days at this point. They raised awareness for Jonelle and a $20,000 reward. The committee arranged for 600 volunteers to search for Jonelle. They created posters and mailed them out internationally. Jim made a statement that it was a disgrace that we spend more money looking for stolen cars than children. That's horrible.
It is a disgrace.
Jonelle was also one of the first missing children to appear on the United States milk cartons.
Missing children are no longer featured on milk cartons because the idea turned out to be pretty inefficient. By the time the milk carton was printed and sold, the child may have already been found. We also replaced the practice with the internet and with Amber Alerts. Research also found that missing posters were emotionally distressing for other children. Think about, you're 5 or 6 years old, you're pulling a milk carton out of the fridge and you see other little kids that are missing. That isn't something we typically try and put in front of our kids. We try and hide them from that reality.
There's still missing children pictures at Walmart, isn't there? I don't know if you've ever seen those. Like it'll literally be on the wall, like next to the bathroom.
You're right. They did have missing people posters in Walmart. So that would be very similar as far as emotional well-being. There's also very little sales of cardboard milk cartons now. Most of them are plastic jugs. So that kind of turned the tide a little bit as well.
This is like random, but do you remember the milk that you had in elementary? Was it in plastic bags?
Yes.
I love
and
those.
You had to put your finger over the straw.
Yes.
And jab it in the bag.
Yeah, you had to squish
you didn't put your finger over it.
Yes. And stab it.
And the milk would shoot out everywhere if you didn't put your finger over the hole.
Yeah.
Our teachers had to have loved that. That's a hot mess.
Our teachers, frick, I loved it.
Oh, no. I remember kids all in a row making mess after mess with that chocolate milk. Can you imagine having 25 6-year-olds with plastic bags of milk?
This is why you sit with classy people, Paige.
You had classy kindergartners with you?
I don't remember. Who knows? That whole milk process was not thought out thoroughly.
No, it was not. And if you went through the whole way, you poked a hole just through the other side,
then
it was just doomed either way. Yeah. Our poor teachers, they should have been paid more.
And some kids would stab them and then just take the straw out. And then they just squeeze it in their mouths, with the hole that they stabbed with the straw. Did they do that?
Oh my gosh, no. No, ours were all accidental.
Well.
Also, how bad for the environment that was. Plastic bags.
Yeah.
Probably how bad it was for us, too.
Oh, yeah. President Ronald Reagan spoke about Jonelle's case on March 7th, 1985. President Reagan said, quote,
"Well over 1 million American children disappear from their homes or neighborhoods every year, causing, as we can all understand, heartbreaking anguish. Parents cry out for help, many through letters to me. For example, I learned about Jonelle Matthews of Greeley, Colorado, who would have celebrated her 13th birthday with her family just last month. But 5 days before Christmas, Jonelle disappeared from her home."
The president pleads for the press to include a regular feature in their newspapers with information and photos on missing children. By April 29, 1985, Jonelle had been missing for 130 days. After President Reagan's speech, the police department received a flood of tips. Sightings were reported from West Virginia, Washington State, and the East Coast. Unfortunately, nothing adds up to an actual clue for the investigation. Jim was cleared as a suspect, but there were no other suspects. Even with the committee and president attempting to bring awareness, Jonelle's case still went cold. 2 years after Jonelle's disappearance, the Matthews family moved from Greeley, Colorado. On December 20th, 1994, 10 years to the day after Jonelle's disappearance, Jim and Gloria held a memorial service to pronounce Jonelle deceased. In November 1998, Gloria wrote an article for Today's Christian Woman titled, "My Child Was Abducted." In this heartbreaking article, Gloria details how her faith prepared her and gives her strength to endure. Gloria says that she knew right away that something bad had happened to Jonelle, that she wasn't at a movie or a runaway. Police questioned a Norris Drake on Jonelle's disappearance. Norris's mother lived across the street from Jonelle's home. Norris, 32 years old, had been at his mother's house on the night of Jonelle's disappearance. Norris's father had committed suicide in September 1984, and the family was spending more time together at his mother's house. Peggy, Norris's sister, was living in the house at the time. Peggy's husband and Norris watched the Cosby Special stand-up comedy show on HBO from 7 to 9. Peggy remembers asking Norris to leave so they could watch the 10 p.m. news and get around for bed. Norris was an alcoholic but was not drinking while with Peggy that night. He left between 9 to 9:30 or 9 to 10 p.m. Peggy doesn't remember the exact time, but she remembers being impatient for Norris to leave, and she had to ask him to leave twice. After Jonelle's disappearance, Norris was arrested on multiple misdemeanor charges.
There's a lack of information on Norris's arrests, but there was a comment made by Steve Pankey later about Norris being interested in young teen girls. I'm assuming that Norris's arrest may have been along those lines.
Wanky Panky just doesn't know when to quit, does he? If there was a man who always commented on a case of a missing girl, wouldn't he just be a suspect? Right away. He's pointing fingers so the fingers aren't pointed at him. That's true crime 101.
Yeah, I think you're right. Steve Pankey will say anything or point fingers to anyone just to try and get the heat off of him.
Norris died in March 2007 and was not a suspect in the case at that time. His sister was called as a witness at the trial.
They used Peggy's testimony to cause doubt against Steve Pankey as the murderer. They say that Norris might have walked across the street and abducted Jonelle as a predator in the neighborhood at approximately the same time that Jonelle is kidnapped. Detective Robert Cash was assigned to Jonelle's case in 2013. Jennifer and Robert had gone to school together. He says that he knew the family and he felt that failure was never an option. In 2018, Detective Cash attended the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children conference in Virginia. Jonelle's case was the oldest presented during the conference. Attendees gathered in a workshop for 2 days discussing and reviewing Jonelle's disappearance and any possible leads. And I love this idea so much.
Yes.
They had a panel. They worked on it for 48 hours, the smartest and the best in the nation.
Love that.
Detective Cash called Steve Pankey on April 8, 2019. Steve says that he can share some interesting information about Russ Ross's involvement right away. Steve also says he won't say anything until he has a deal that cannot be broken.
Was this the first time that Pankey was being questioned?
It sure was.
Oh my gosh. In 2019.
2019. Yep. Just a couple months later, on July 23, 2019, Jonelle's body was found by a crew digging a pipeline. The location was just southeast of Greeley, 15 minutes from her home. Investigators were able to confirm Jonelle's cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. Detective Cash says that he knew right away it had to be Jonelle based on her braces, clothes, and the age of the remains. She had the same exact clothes on as the choir concert, plus she was wearing a coat that had been pulled over her head. A DNA sample from Jonelle's biological parents confirmed the remains belonged to Jonelle. There was no other DNA at the scene. Investigators believe that Jonelle was on her knees looking up at the gun when she was murdered due to the downward trajectory of the bullet. It appears that the coat had been pulled over her head and then she was shot.
That's terrible.
Absolutely horrifying. She's 12 years old. Detective Cash contacted Gloria and Jim Matthews on July 24th to let them know they found the remains that they believed to be Jonelle's. In August 2019, Jonelle's remains were laid to rest at Lynn Grove Cemetery in Greeley, Colorado. Investigators made the 9-hour drive to Steve Pankey's home in Idaho on August 15th, 2019. They knock on his door, and Steve says, "Are you here to read me my rights?" Which is an odd thing to say if you don't have a guilty conscience. Steve again announces that he won't talk unless he has a deal, but investigators explain the only thing they could charge him with would be Jonelle's murder due to the statute of limitations. Steve looked at them and said, "I need a deal." And to investigators, they knew he was admitting to murder without admitting to it.
In September 2019, Steve Pankey's Twin Falls, Idaho home was searched by police with a search warrant. Steve was not home at the time.
The body cam from police is available. So as the police officers are going in, you can see this really strange house. Steve has no couches. He has no TV, no radio. You can see a paper shredder sitting in the middle of what looks to be his living room floor. And that's not really addressed in the video. They're not really concerned about it. What they are concerned about is the fact that he has 3 cell phones, 2 laptops, and 14 handguns in this house.
Those laptops showed a serious connection to Jonelle. On July 25th, Steve realized her remains had been found. He was awake searching for information for almost 36 hours. They had time-stamped searches showing specific times and the information he was looking up. There was no break for Steve to sleep. Steve was also listening to podcasts about the case. Steve searched Jonelle's name thousands of times. I was just thinking of him listening to this podcast.
He could from prison.
Don't tell me that.
He likes podcasts. He's okay with podcasts, but no radios.
That's messed up. He's messed up in the head.
Agreed.
Well, if he's listening to this podcast, hey, Wanky. Don't care for you. On September 18th, 2019, Steve took to social media, news, and podcast interviews saying he was being falsely accused. The Matthews family didn't know who Steve Pankey was when he showed up on social media and the news in 2018. So who was Steve Pankey? In 1984, Steve was a 33-year-old car salesman. Steve had lived about 2 miles from the Matthews home in Greeley. He was married to Angela Hicks, and they had a 5-year-old son. Steve's father was a Baptist preacher and a judge. In 1977, Steve was arrested for sexually assaulting 26-year-old Deb Moon, a woman that he met at church. Steve claims that he was dating Deb, and it was consensual. Deb claimed that it was non-consensual but rape.
In 2021, investigators reached out to Deb Moon and interviewed her. She described herself as the Jonelle Matthews that got away, which is so eerie. It gives me goosebumps.
She got lucky.
She really did. Steve drove her into the country and raped her for 4 hours. When it went to court, the male prosecutor said it was a he said, she said situation, and the charges were dropped.
I hate this.
I know.
I hate this so much. I just want to scream at the top of my lungs. That's disgusting.
That they looked at her and said, there's no proof. This has to be he said, she said. And they basically strong-armed her into dropping the charges against him. There are some consequences here. Steve was excommunicated from Sunnyview Nazarene Church, and he was so mad about this that on several occasions, church members had to physically pick him up and remove him from church services.
So they basically shunned him. They were like,
pretty much.
Boop, you're out.
Even though the charges had been dropped, they believed her story, and they did not want him there. So they had, like I said, had to physically pick him up and get him out of their services. Not once, but multiple times.
And think of this too, Deb probably got support from the church as well, so that would have been nice.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's nice that they had her back, as they should have. Like, they obviously believed that this had been rape. Regardless of what the court decided there, the church members believed her.
Yeah, the law was not behind her, but the Lord was.
Absolutely.
Steve married Angela in October 1978. Angela says that Steve became abusive almost right away. At one point, he hits her in the mouth with a heavy metal padlock, then kicks her in the back before forcing her into the car. Steve then drives Angela to her father's cabin and leaves her there for 5 days. He comes back and, by way of greeting and apology, tells her to make him a sandwich. Anything could set Steve off, and he told Angela that if she left him, he would shoot both boys, then her, then himself.
Steve had an old-fashioned view of marriage that he got from his father. Shortly after Steve and Angela had been married, Steve's father told Angela that her job was to obey her husband. If Steve asked her to dance on a restaurant table naked, she had better get up on that table and dance.
Whatever. Oh my goodness.
Thank goodness my marriage isn't like this.
You know, when I said about that part with her making him a sandwich, it just reminds me of that episode in Hey Arnold. Do you remember that episode in Hey Arnold? Have you ever watched Hey Arnold?
I saw it.
I
did not like that show.
The old creepy man, and he'd always, like, his wife would come home, and he was always, like, sitting on the recliner, and he'd be like, Susie, make me a sandwich. Do you remember that?
No.
Oh, my God.
That show is horrible. That's funny. Your old-fashioned marriage, I guess.
He had a football head.
Yeah, they did. 90s TV.
Sorry, I just had to bring that up. Remember that January 1985 phone call from Pastor Steve Pankey? Yeah, that was the first documented time that Steve asserted himself in the investigation. Steve says that he was a youth pastor, but Jim Matthews says that Steve was the janitor at Sunnyview Nazarene Church. Steve says that he has an alibi for the night Jonelle disappeared. He was at home with his wife and child. Steve continued to say that the morning after Jonelle disappeared, his family left Greeley for 5 days. They spent Christmas in California with Steve's parents and returned on the 26th.
We're supposed to believe that almost 35 years later, Steve still remembers what he was doing that evening when it was as uneventful as staying at home with his family.
Yeah, no. Steve says about a month after Jonelle's disappearance, he had contacted the Fort Collins FBI office. Steve told the FBI that 7 days after Jonelle's disappearance, his father-in-law was contacted by a police officer who said he wanted a body buried. Steve's father-in-law worked as a groundskeeper for the Greeley Cemetery. Steve told the FBI that he was afraid someone might try to implicate him in Jonelle's murder.
The police have not confirmed if Steve did contact anyone like he says that he did. I'm also not sure of the timeline of this call either. It may have been before or after that January 1985 call to Greeley police. Steve did have several run-ins with the Greeley Police Department, including the day before Jonelle disappeared. Steve had been arrested for arguing with a bank teller to the point where police were called. In 1984, Steve was working with Russ Ross, the dad that dropped Jonelle off at her home on December 20th. Russ was a supervisor at a 7-Up distributor, and Steve seemed to be happy at the time that Russ was being investigated. In the 1990s, Steve and his family bounced around different cities in Idaho. Steve would consistently work as a mortician, but never stayed at a job long. He would also file frivolous lawsuits to supplement his income.
I just want to be clear here. So he actually was not a pastor.
He was never a pastor. The police call it dabbling. Basically, he couldn't hold a job for long, so he just bounces around and dabbles in all kinds of different things. The job that he's most consistent at, though, is mortician. He files lawsuits for all kinds of things. Anything that he thinks he can get some money, just a quick money grab, he files a lawsuit. In late 1996 or early 97, Steve was pulled over for a traffic stop in Idaho. He starts recording the police incident himself. Steve is quoted saying,
"Don't F with me. I've buried more people than you'll know."
The officer asks where these bodies are, and Steve responds by saying they're in Colorado. But then, that's it. There's no follow-up here.
You know, I think the Greeley Police Department really did a wonderful job with everything with the investigation of Jonelle and took care. But some part of me thinks that they just completely dropped the ball on Pankey. He sounded like a shit talker, and nobody likes shit talkers because it's an unending wormhole of bullshit.
Which is exactly what it is with Steve Pankey. It's sorting through all of the lies and all of the finger pointing to try and find the truth. I agree here, though, that this 1996-97 incident with the traffic stop, when he pulls over and starts recording the incident himself and then says that he's buried more people than you'll know, they should have found some reason to arrest him or follow him home. There needed to have been somebody watching him. I realize this is Idaho and not Colorado, but I cannot imagine that as a police officer, that's a statement that somebody says to you every day that you're just like, meh, he's crazy. It's fine.
Yeah, and if you watch interviews of him, I don't understand what he's saying because he's over here and then over there, and he just jumps sentences, kind of like he's jumping the jobs.
He really does. Even in August 2019, when the police go to talk to him the first time, he starts talking to them about the most random things, like his sexual orientation. And they're like, what? We're here trying to talk about a murder investigation or what you know about Jonelle Matthews. And he starts talking about how he's bisexual. It really throws them. And maybe that's the point.
Yeah.
He's trying to unsettle them a little bit. Steve, Angela, and their 2 sons were renting an apartment from one of Angela's clients in 1999. When Angela went to pick up her paycheck, the employer wouldn't release it since they had not paid the rent. Angela confronted Steve about the unpaid rent, and he said that the money had gone to his legal defense because the police were prosecuting him in the Jonelle Matthews case. Steve turned to Angela and said,
"Do you really think I would hurt her when she looks so much like you?"
Angela said that her blood runs cold. She starts to piece together some small things that she had seen throughout the years. It's been a long time since she's gone missing, and now 10 years later, he's saying, hey, I couldn't pay the rent. This money had to go to my legal defenses. And she's like, what? What legal defenses? And even that's a lie because they're not prosecuting him in 99.
So he would have hurt Jonelle if she didn't look like his wife? Like, what is he trying to prove here?
I'm not sure what his point is here. Like, either way, well, you would hurt her if she looks like Angela, or you would hurt her if she doesn't look like Angela. Don't hurt her either way.
Yeah. What are you trying to do here, buddy?
Also in 1999, Steve was in trouble for causing another scene at a bank. He wrote that the conviction was partially an attempt to force him to become an informant in Jonelle's disappearance, and he was afraid he would get the death penalty for revealing the location of her body. So he's arrested here for causing yet another scene in a bank, and his mind goes straight to Jonelle. Why would he bring her up 15 years later unless it's a guilty conscience? And why would he imply that he knew where she was buried? No one even knew she was dead in 1999.
It's that shit-talking syndrome. It's flooding out and the truth is coming out, you know? His guilt is catching up on him. And, you know, even though he was a janitor, when you are surrounded by the Lord's word, like he was in those churches, I mean, and his dad being a pastor, he was probably on edge. It was like the Holy Ghost was haunting him and he was cracking. It was just flowing out of his mouth.
I agree. Maybe it brought it all back to the surface for him because the last time he had been in trouble at a bank was the day before Jonelle went missing. This does seem to be that he's cracking here.
In 2001, Angela filed for divorce from Steve. Hallelujah. They had been married for 23 years. Angela and the two boys got a civil protection order so that Steve could not come around them. Steve moves to Shoshone, Idaho.
Shoshone is gorgeous with huge waterfalls, mountains in the distance. It's also a very small town with 1,600 people in it in 2020.
That sounds like a good visit.
Now that he's not there anymore, absolutely.
Yes. I found this surprising, that Steve ran for Idaho Republican governor in 2002. He used $300,000 from his inheritance to run for governor, but does not win the election. Shocker. In 2004 and 2008, Steve ran for sheriff even though he didn't have any experience with law enforcement. He didn't win either election. He continued to run for office. He ran for governor twice. Even after the search warrant on his home in 2019, Steve decided to run for sheriff a third time.
In his attempt for Idaho governor in 2014, Steve was rejected by the Constitution Party after claiming they attempted to do an exorcism on him. He is never elected for any of the positions. His slogan for the election is, "No hanky with Pankey." Hanky would be like no dubious behavior, and he has nothing but dubious behavior.
Well, guess what, Hanky Panky? You're Wanky Panky. And we all know what wank means, if you know what I mean. So he's very wanky.
That's what I thought too when he said no hanky with Panky, because all I know is the no hanky panky. And I was like, ew, what? Obviously not what he's meaning.
He's something else. He's an alien, that's what he is. He's not from Earth.
It's definitely questionable on if he's mentally sound. Like, I have questions about mental illness with him.
In 2019, police were not talking to the media, but Steve talked to anyone who would listen. Steve would say that police showed up in SWAT gear and pointing guns in his face during the search of his home. Steve wrote a letter to the media. In the letter, Steve named himself as a person of interest and the Greeley mayor as a person of interest. In an interview, Steve is quoted saying,
"I've never met Jonelle Matthews. I've never met anybody in her family. Make sure the viewers hear that. I voluntarily gave my DNA. I offered to take a polygraph."
Eventually, Steve's attorney made him stop talking about the case. He was like, "Panky, shut the hell up."
Yep, shut your trap, man.
On October 12, 2020, 36 years after Jonelle's disappearance, Steve Pankey was arrested for kidnapping and first-degree murder. At Steve's bond hearing, the bond was initially requested at $10 million. Steve's attorney argued that Steve was almost 70 years old and a low flight risk. But with the $1 million trust fund and a $400,000 house, the judge set Steve's bail at $5 million in cash.
The judge did not allow assets to be used as collateral for the bond. The judge also ordered that Steve surrender his passport, be fitted with a GPS monitor, have no contact with any witnesses, and not leave Colorado if he was able to bond out, which was pretty steep even for Steve. He can't bond out.
Yeah.
On February 3rd, 2021, Steve pled not guilty to the charges of kidnapping and murder. The trial started on October 13th, 2021. The prosecution says that Steve had been following Russ Ross due to the hatred from Sunnyview Church and working together at the 7-Up distributor. They also had a lawsuit situation where Steve was suing Russ. Steve saw Russ drop Jonelle off at a dark home and knew this was his opportunity to frame Russ. There's no DNA or physical evidence linking Steve Pankey to the crime. Steve took to the stand for 2 days. Immediately after he was under oath, Steve said that he lied about his involvement in the case. Steve lied about his father-in-law and the mayor's involvement out of bitterness, saying, quote,
"It was a polite way of flipping them the bird. It was pure hatred on my part."
Steve also says that Angela was lying about the sudden California trip. It had been planned for weeks, and he had first heard about Jonelle's disappearance on the radio on the drive back to Greeley. On stand, Steve said that Angela was fueled by her own need for revenge against him. From Steve's point of view, he's the victim. Everyone's trying to blame him. I don't find it a very polite way to flip off your father-in-law or the mayor by involving them in a murder investigation.
Did he mean like flipping off the authorities maybe by giving them like misleading information involving his father-in-law? Or you just think he was like flipping his father-in-law off right away?
My husband and I sat down and watched several hours of this trial. He's talking about his father-in-law and the mayor. I don't know what he has against the mayor, but that poor mayor, he gets drug in and he's like, what? And I don't think it's polite at all. Like it's just Steve trying to manipulate the situation here.
Seems like that mayor wasn't hanky for Pankey.
Nope, he did not vote hanky for Pankey. Sharon Stala, a 4th grade teacher that worked under Jim Matthews, took the stand. On the stand, Sharon says she never discussed the case with Jim, but she did see an Unsolved Mysteries with John Walsh. Right away, when I'm watching her on the stand, I'm like, Unsolved Mysteries with John Walsh? Unsolved Mysteries had multiple hosts. The one that I know the most is Robert Stack. John Walsh was America's Most Wanted or In Pursuit. The defense brought Sharon on stand, and the point was that the rake marks were common knowledge because she had seen it on, she says Unsolved Mysteries, but she had seen this on TV. I'm not sure that she proves that for me. Greeley was a small town. She probably heard about the rake marks as word of mouth or from working with Jim, maybe indirectly. Steve Pankey's ex-wife, Angela Hicks, took the stand against him in trial. She described December 21st, 1984, the day after Jonelle's disappearance.
According to Angela, Steve had told her to get ready. They were leaving for California for Christmas.
This trip was not planned. Several weeks before Christmas, Steve's parents had asked them to come and visit, but Steve said they weren't going. Then, Steve told her they were leaving before dawn and to get packing. They had 2 Great Dane dogs, and when Angela asked what they would do with the dogs, Steve responded not to worry about the dogs, he had dumped them.
I hope they serve dog shit to him in prison.
I know, these poor dogs. I did so much research into this because I was trying to find out, like, when he says dumped them, does he mean, like, dumped them with a neighbor? Does he mean dumped them on a road or on a nice farm upstate? Like, what does that mean? And apparently I'm the only one that was concerned about the dogs because there's no other information out there. And every time they talk about them, it's always, quote, he dumped them. Like, what does that mean? Did he kill them and he dumped their bodies? Like, I went worst case scenario here.
That is what I'm thinking, because
He killed them?
Yeah, why wouldn't they use the word drop? Like, they dropped them off, at the neighbors, or they dropped them out on the field and let them run and be free away from that tormented house.
Yeah, you can only imagine what they were seeing. Those poor dogs.
Great Danes, too. They're so beautiful.
That's what I was thinking, too. Aren't they valuable? Like, couldn't he have sold them It must have been some pretty short notice if he couldn't find them a good home or sell them.
Well, he probably thought he didn't have time. He was freaking out.
Which supports Angela's story.
Yep. They arrived on December 23rd at Big Bear, California. His family was not expecting them. Steve and his dad got into an argument on Christmas morning. They packed up the bags and headed back home. When they were 2 or 3 hours away from Greeley, Steve insisted they listen to the radio. He made her flip the dial in search of the news about Jonelle for several hours on the drive back.
This is another memorable thing for Angela because, like we discussed before, Steve had banned all music, TV, radio, and newspapers from their home earlier that year.
Once back to Greeley, Steve drove right past their home and to the grocery store to buy newspapers. Angela had to read each article on Jonelle to Steve. Angela says that when they finally got back home, Steve goes inside, changes into coveralls, and starts digging in the front yard. Investigators used radar detection over the front yard, but found nothing.
But that was 36 years later. Like, at any point, he could have gone back and dug it back up.
Exactly. Angela also states that Steve set the interior of their car on fire, but wouldn't tell her why. Angela found a piece of legal paper in their trash. Steve had written a note about footprints in the snow being raked over.
This is a key fact in the prosecution's case. So like we said, in 1984, only the Matthews family, investigators, and the killer would have known about the footsteps being covered with a rake. It was not information released to the public, so the question is, how did Steve know? He even mentions it to investigators in 2019. Steve's attorney says that the police told Steve about the raked footprints, not the other way around. Angela took that letter, she hid it in the sole of her shoe, and took it straight to the police. From there, she was advised to mail the document to Greeley Police Department. She waited for Greeley to contact her, but the file was lost. So she waited 25 years to be contacted by investigators.
This poor woman.
She had so many of the connecting pieces, and for whatever reason, that file was lost. And she was so scared, she snuck it out of the house in her shoe. Think about the risk that she was taking, knowing that she lived in an abusive household. She's the victim of domestic abuse, and she's scared for her children's lives. And she's trying to get this to police, and then it's gone. Like, we still, 36 years later, we have no idea where that letter went.
Yeah, she probably was just terrified. She was terrified, and she reported him, of course. But, maybe someone in that situation is just so terrified that, like, once they report someone once or even a couple times, they're like, okay, like, there's not much more I can do.
Sure.
And I need to not push this any further because her life and her children's lives are at stake. That's what she could be thinking. In February 1985, Angela was working as a church janitor at Faith Ministries. Steve was still working at a car dealership and also buying total vehicles from insurance claims, repairing and selling them. They were very poor, but things were looking up with Angela's part-time job at the church. At a Sunday service, the church minister said that he had heard from God, and God told him that Jonelle would be returned safely to her family. Steve looked at Angela and said, "He's a false prophet." He stands up and says, "False prophet," again. 2 ushers escorted Steve out of the church. I mean, this just gets worse and worse.
It really does. Angela said that every time the doors opened, you could hear Steve out in the lobby just going ballistic, screaming and yelling about how the minister is a false prophet.
Like, I just don't understand how nobody suspects that this man had something to do with Jonelle's disappearance, like, at this time. Like, it's totally awful.
There's just so many small things that so many different people saw. And Angela saw the most of it. I'm with you. I don't understand how it went 30 plus years before they were able to take this to trial. Back to 2021, in his closing argument, Steve's defense attorney stated that Steve has a mental illness, and that's why he inserted himself in the investigation. The prosecution immediately pushed back, saying that Steve Pankey does not have a mental illness. He's a master manipulator. On November 2nd, 2021, the jury returned with a verdict. They found Steve guilty of making false reports to authorities. The jury was deadlocked on the murder charge, and it ended in mistrial. The second trial began on October 7th, 2022. The defense team was able to enter more information on the second trial due to Steve's responses in the first trial. For example, Angela Hicks had been told to keep her testimony short, with 5 words or less answers at the first trial. But after Steve says Angela was a woman scorned in her response to his relationship with him, the prosecution could explain why she was quote-unquote scorned. Angela also found more writings from her time living with Steve. There was a piece of paper saying 2 cops living within a block of Jonelle Matthews, which was interesting because Steve said he had never been to Jonelle's neighborhood.
Yeah, you know damn well he did this.
Deb Moon, the 1977 rape victim, agreed to take the stand to talk about the rape. Angela Hicks also took to the stand again and told her story more in depth this time. Jim Matthews asked Steve to confess to Jonelle's kidnapping and murder, telling him, quote,
"The gates of heaven can still open for you. It's not too late, Steve Pankey. God is waiting."
Steve responded by saying,
"I am a Christian. I will be in heaven. I am innocent, and this is not justice for Jonelle."
At Steve's sentencing hearing on October 31st, 2022, Jennifer said that 12,634 days had passed since Jonelle's disappearance on December 20th, 1984. She talked about never growing up with her sister, and her son having never met his aunt. Steve was found guilty of second-degree kidnapping with use of a deadly weapon, felony murder, and false reporting to authorities. Steve received a sentence of life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 20 years. He was granted time served for false reporting to authorities charged in 2021. He was found not guilty of first-degree murder. Steve will be 91 years old in November 2040 when he is eligible for parole. Steve is serving his sentence at the Arkansas Valley Correctional Facility in Colorado.
Angela Hicks finally met Jim and Gloria Matthews in May 2024. Steve Pankey has never fully confessed to Jonelle Matthews' murder. We don't have a true motive or forensic evidence either. Based on Angela's testimony, it appears that Steve's motive might have been that he was angry at Sunnyview Church where Jonelle attended. He was angry and suing Russ Ross, possibly following Russ from the choir concert to Jonelle's home, and saw an opportunity to frame Russ for kidnapping or murder. Jonelle looked like Angela, and we know he was abusive to her. What do we think here? Is Steve wrongfully convicted?
The prosecution was unable to prove that Steve was in the neighborhood on December 20th, 1984. They were unable to confirm if Steve owned a gun of the caliber matching the murder weapon, or if Steve even knew Jonelle or the family. There is enough evidence of abuse of Angela and the kids to obtain a protection order, and we know that Steve inserted himself into the investigation time and time again. Every time he's arrested or talking to the police, he brings up Jonelle, which says to me that he's got a guilty conscience. But when police tell Steve that the only thing they can charge him with is murder, he doesn't respond. And that's either because he thinks he's the smartest person in the room, or it's because he's genuinely the murderer. To me, watching the trial, I'm not sure why they removed Jonelle's neighbor Norris Drake from the list. He does seem like a very likely option. There's no signs of struggle, almost like Jonelle walked away with whoever abducted her. Maybe she didn't know Norris, but she might have known of him. She might have known that he was the neighbor's son. And, hey, I need some help. Can you come and help me here? She walked away, or she would have opened the door for him. At the end of the day, I think that Steve is guilty. There's a lot of evidence from what Angela says to convict him. I really wish that he had confessed or there had been some forensic evidence. If you take Angela out of the situation, you take the papers that she found out or her statements from trial, there's not a whole lot there that they can use to convict him of murder. So it makes me uncomfortable. If I was on the jury, I'm not sure that I would convict him. I feel like there's reasonable doubt there. You're literally taking his ex-wife's word. You know, that's an easy thing, as he's saying, to be the scorned ex-wife.
I think Wanky did it. I think he did it. I don't understand really what his motive would be, other than, like, I keep thinking about Deb Moon and how he raped her. I know Jonelle wasn't raped, but did he have intentions to do it? And maybe he just couldn't follow through, and he felt the need that he had to clean up his mess, and that's why he had to murder her. I still do think there's a possibility of the neighbor doing it, but ultimately I feel like the fingers point at you, Wanky.
I agree. There's just too many small coincidences pointing right back to him. How many times he brings her name up.
Mm-hmm.
That's strange.
I think, like you said, though, mental illness has to be involved in this. Something has to be not screwed in right up at the noggin. Carl Pankey, Steve's son, was murdered on July 4th, 2008. There's minimal information about the murder. Carl was 20 years old and appears to have been shot by his girlfriend while attending college in Arizona.
E10 Pats was the first child to appear on a milk carton in early 1985. E10 had disappeared on May 25, 1979, while walking to the school bus for the first time in New York City. At 6 years old, E10 did not arrive at school, and his teachers did not notify his parents. E10 is presumed to have been murdered, but his body has never been found. His murderer was finally convicted in 2017. And the really sad thing about this case is that for 30 years, his parents did not move and his parents did not change their phone number, so that on the chance that he was alive, he would know their address and he would know their phone number and could still contact them.
Oh my goodness, that tore my heart out.
I would like to do an episode on this case as well. The person that kills him lived in the apartment complex with them. He lived in that building with them. So they don't think that E10 ever even went on this walk, that he never even left the building.
Oh my goodness.
Truly, it's horrifying. And if you look up E10's name, you'll recognize these photos. He's a beautiful blonde boy.
So cute.
His face, he's gorgeous. His face is familiar to me, but his name was not, which is really sad.
Mm-hmm.
His dad was actually a photographer. So there's these outstanding photos of him. And I think that's probably why there was so much publicity on the photos. He's a cute kid, and there were really nice photos out there.
Let's hop on that one because I want to know more about that story.
Absolutely. We'll put that one on the list.
We have a list, guys.
Send us your case suggestions.
We'll do anything. Anything. No.
We have some limitations, but we will take suggestions.
I mean, at first, if you remember, we discussed when we do this podcast, we are not doing children. We are setting that aside because we're we can't handle it.
Yeah.
But even with this E10, it's heartbreaking to hear, yes, but it also gives it a chance for his voice to be heard when he's not here. And I think that's important. So we can do those on occasion.
We would love for you to become part of the Corrupt crew. You can find us on Patreon with multiple tiers and PayPal. This will score you our appreciation and will announce your name in a future episode. Both links are in the episode notes. Case suggestions and feedback can be emailed to us at corruptpod@gmail.com.
The sources for this episode will be listed in the episode notes. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads. Don't forget to subscribe to catch our new Corrupt content. Please also leave us a review wherever you're listening to this episode. Bye.
Bye.